Okay, so it's wonderful to see so many people here. My name is Catherine Boyd. I'm an educator at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, and I'm going to hand over to Tali, who will introduce you to our guest speaker for the day.
Thank you so much, Kath, for hosting us so graciously. Thank you so much, Liz, for joining us all the way from Jerusalem. And my name is Tali Nates. I'm the director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. And it is wonderful to welcome and greet friends and colleagues from around the world. I think the badge of honor must be going to Bob McCormack, that is joining us all the way from the United States, middle of the night. But it shows dedication, but it also shows how loved Liz is and how we all so looking forward to learn from you this morning. Special welcome to our colleagues from the 3 Holocaust and Genocide Centers around the country, the Durban, the Cape Town, and of course the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Centers, all under the umbrella of the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation. It is wonderful to cooperate again with Yad Vashem. We have a long history of cooperation and partnership with Yad Vashem, and in a minute, I will introduce Liz, and you will see that we are fortunate to have many different aspects from Yad Vashem. The first webinar we had was about poetry. Today will be about art. And in the future, we will have other webinars about other topics. It is really wonderful to really look at art today. In our Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center permanent exhibition, art, poetry, and music play a huge educational place and value, and it is something that we do around all our educational programs. So with that in mind, we invited Liz Elsby to empower our knowledge and our connections to how to use art when we teach about the Holocaust, when we teach about Theresienstadt, when we teach about Warsaw, when we teach about even the concentration camps and even the killing centers. So Liz Elsby has worked at Yad Vashem since 2006 as a Holocaust educator and a museum tour guide. She also guides educational groups in Poland, in Prague, in Theresienstadt and Terezin, and in Berlin, as well as teaching about the Holocaust to teachers, specifically in the United States through Yad Vashem and Echoes and Reflections. Liz is also an artist. She's an illustrator and graphic designer and lives with her family in Jerusalem, Israel. I had the pleasure of meeting you, Liz, some years ago. You also took a group from South Africa to Poland, and of course, you're part of March of the Living, and we're so happy to again partner with you today. So the floor is yours.
Okay, can everyone hear me? All right, first of all, thank you so much for such a lovely greeting. Just my PowerPoint. And special shout out to my friend Bob from Oklahoma and everyone else. Catherine, can we see the PowerPoints working? Thumbs up for the PowerPoint, fabulous. All right, friends. So again, thank you so much for coming out. And today we're going to be talking about a subject that's very dear to my heart. Telling the story through art. Primo Levi used words. Some survivors, some people who were, people in the Holocaust, use the written language. Holocaust artists told the story through their artwork. And as such, for me, it's one of the most moving and beautiful types of Holocaust testimony. And I hope today to really surprise you. Because if we have this notion that all Holocaust art has the same motifs, the yellow star, the barbed wire, I hope to really surprise you today with some other examples. So if I'm using that word Holocaust art, we have to define, first of all, Is it? Why is it going? Okay, there we go. What is a piece of Holocaust art? At Yad Vashem, we usually consider Holocaust art to be any art that was created around 1933 when the Nazis came to power, all the way to about 1948. And the reason I say 1948 is it really took 2 or 3 years for survivors to finally be back on track somewhere after the Holocaust, to have found some kind of new home. You know, the Bergen-Belsen as a DP camp, as a camp for survivors, actually functioned till 1950. So the experience is still very raw and very telling in 1948. So that's usually the time period. Just a little quick information about Yad Vashem's collection. We have more than 10,000 pieces of artwork, which may seem like a lot. But if you think about from 1933 to 1948, how many artists must have been working and how many pieces of artwork were created. And all we have is this tiny amount in our collection and your collection and other museums in the world. How much was lost? So that's the parameters. And we're going to talk about how we decipher a piece of Holocaust art, because it's a little different than going to, let's say, the Metropolitan Museum of Art and seeing Picasso and this kind of enjoying the artwork on its own merits and seeing it, you know, through the lens of maybe an art critic. Holocaust art, even though if you know the story of the artist, if you see the Picasso, it makes it all the more meaningful. But with Holocaust art, we have to know the story of the artist. None of these people were born to be Holocaust artists. They were born to be artists. They were born to have lives, and all of that was taken away from them because of the Holocaust. So we have to know the story, if possible, of the artist. Sometimes we don't know that story at all. Sometimes we just know fragments. We need to know how it was found and how it was created. And all of these things sometimes is simply impossible. Sometimes someone will bring a piece of artwork to Yad Vashem that was simply given to them or that they found, and we don't know anything about it. So knowing the story of the artist, I think, is very important when we look at a piece of art, Holocaust art specifically. So I'm going to jump in right away. I'm going to pick artists from different experiences in the Holocaust. Almost every single artist I'm going to show you did not survive, which gets to be rather depressing to see such people with such promise and such a voice, and to know those voices were stifled forever in places like Auschwitz and Dachau, etc. But I'll begin with an artist called Felix Nussbaum. And some of you may be familiar with him. Let's look at this piece of work. First, let me tell you his story so that we can understand where he's coming from. And Felix Nussbaum was an artist from Germany, Jewish artist. He was born in Osnabrück, Germany. Very up-and-coming young man, very talented. So talented, in fact, that the Berlin Academy sent him to Italy on a scholarship to study. And he's been painting in Italy, the Mediterranean sunshine, feeling free and really kind of discovering himself as an artist. He meets a fellow artist called Felka Platek, a woman who comes from Poland, Jewish woman, and life would have gone on quite nicely had the Nazis not come to power in 1933. He gets word that his studio has been burnt down. You can imagine how devastating this is for an artist to have all of his artwork burnt down, and he makes a very sad decision. He realizes that in the eyes of his countrymen, he is no longer Felix Nussbaum, the artist. Now he's just Felix Nussbaum, Jew, and he makes a decision not to go back to Germany. He goes to Italy. Later on, he goes to Belgium. He goes into hiding when the Nazis take over Belgium. He is caught. He's sent to a camp called Saint-Cyprien, which is in the south of France, boiling hot sands, very terrible place. It's for German dissidents. He managed to escape from Saint-Cyprien. He goes back into hiding with Felka back in Belgium. And it's there that his artwork gives him away. Because if anyone, I know I saw some of you are artists, oil paints are very smelly. The turpentine, the linseed oil, it's not something you can kind of, hide. And apparently a neighbor smelled these smells in a house that was supposed to be empty. The Gestapo was called, the couple was arrested, they were sent to Auschwitz in 1944, and they were both murdered. So now we know the story of the artist, Let's take a look at this piece of artwork now. And I know that for teachers, this is an amazing tool. How do you teach what it means to be a person who's so hated and so reviled that no country in the world will let them in? And that really was the case of most Jewish people. By 1939, with very few exceptions, most of the world was closing its doors to desperate Jewish refugees. So when we look at this piece of work, and again, I want to emphasize that to enjoy a piece of artwork, you don't have to have a PhD in art history. You don't have to, have the vocabulary. You just need to really look at it and really kind of feel it. So the first thing we see are these very dark, brooding gray colors. We notice the perspective. The perspective is kind of the angle, how we see a work, has this very sharp table taking us in, kind of leads us in right to this figure who's bent over. We could suppose perhaps that that figure is the artist himself. He's bent over, he's in despair. Notice that the artist did things to make us uncomfortable. Notice that the little pinnacle of this table, the corner, seems to be about to pierce the head of this young artist, of this man bent over, as if he's going to whack his head on that angle. There he is in despair. In front of him, you can see this kind of bundle with a little cane attached to it. And anyone who saw the movie, what was the movie with Charlie Chaplin? I forgot the name of the movie. The one where he plays the vagabond who goes from one place to another. In the 1920s, 1910s, if you had nothing, you wrapped that nothing up in a handkerchief. You kind of attached it to a makel, a stick. You slung it over your back, and you went from one place to the other. There it is in front of him, the symbol really of the wandering Jew. The Jew who was so reviled, the Jew who was so unwanted. He goes from pillar to post. No country will let him in. No country wants him. Our eyes move to that globe, and that's a very menacing globe. It's not a nice globe. It's not a safe-looking globe. And notice the globe is kind of being enveloped by darkness. We've heard that symbolic term, the darkness of humanity. There's that darkness covering the globe. Soon there'll be no place for Jews to run away to. The world is being engulfed in darkness, and that globe seems to be menacing him. The room is very, very closed in. There's corners, it's dark. The only exit here is here on the left, this kind of arched exitway. And here's what's so wonderful about artwork. Felix Nussbaum did not leave a list. You can only understand my artwork this way. If you think of it any other way, you're wrong. We are free to interpret. We can really kind of interpret what we're seeing here. And for those of you who are guides or teachers, I think it's really amazing how people kind of interpret that outside. And I wish we were kind of all sitting in a forum where we could just discuss, but I'll tell you what many people have said before. If you see the trees on the left, and if you're familiar with Jewish cemeteries in Poland, and those of you who have been to Poland, think about the Okopowa Cemetery in Warsaw, the motif of the tree with the limbs cut off, the limbs kind of, the dead tree is a symbol of a life cut short. And you can see these trees outside. You can see it's a very kind of bare, uninspiring landscape. There doesn't seem to be any salvation outside. And look at the birds flying in the sky. And it always really fascinates me how people interpret those birds. Some people interpret them as birds of carrion, kind of coming to swoop down on a corpse, on a dead person. Some of them interpret them as birds of freedom. But overall, it's a very freedom that he can't have. He can't get out that door. There's no place to go. It's a very dark, it's a very depressing picture. I think in one picture, for those of you who are guides and those of you who are teachers, there's so much we can learn or use this picture. Why did that happen to him? Why is he so reviled? Why is he stuck in a corner? How come the world isn't doing anything? All of these things we can interpret from this one painting. So that is called The Refugee. And I'm going to see another painting by Felix Nussbaum. It's one of his last paintings. Remember, he's murdered in 1944. It's an incredibly powerful painting, in my opinion. First of all, for those of you who are artists, notice the portrait. I know when I draw portraits, the eyes are very, very important to me. I usually use them to kind of, grab my audience, and they have a dialogue with those eyes. Or it could be the opposite. The artist won't let the figure have a dialogue with you. The eyes are looking somewhere else. But he's looking right at us. What is our position here? Who are we? Are we somebody who's come to save him? Are we someone who is in the same position as he is? Are we the Gestapo, the police? You can tell he looks terrified. He's kind of holding up his jacket to identify his Jewish star. That's the star Jews were forced to wear in Belgium. He has his Jewish identity card there, and that's the name of the drawing, the painting, portrait with identity card. This is really a man who's terrified. Again, the motif of the backed-in corner. He's backed into the corner. He's backed into the wall. There's no place to go. Notice the same colors, dark, brooding. But now look above, and you'll see the motif of the tree again. And now you can see it kind of even more detailed. Again, if you go to Jewish cemeteries, old Jewish cemeteries, when there was still a Jewish population, you will see all over the cemeteries this motif with the tree, with the limbs cut off. But behind that is something very interesting. Does everyone see there's like a blossom? There's a little blossoming branch behind it. Now we know in 2020 that poor Felix Nussbaum was taken and eventually murdered in Auschwitz. He didn't know that was going to be his fate. And for many Jewish people, the impossibility that you would actually send people to a camp where they would be put into gas chambers and murdered, even if they had heard rumors, was so outlandish, so outrageous, that we have that little, I was kind of interpreted as hope. Maybe this will end, maybe spring will come back, maybe the dead tree will come back to life. So we have this kind of little hopeful image there of the flowering tree. If you let your eyes move to the sky, again, those birds, those kind of menacing birds, or birds representing freedom. And then everyone look at the window. And notice how that window is placed in such a way, if you were standing in that room, you would be able to see this little scene from the safety behind those curtains. And we could ask ourselves, what does that window represent? Is that what we call a bystander, someone watching from the window, someone who's not willing to get involved, not willing to stand up, not willing to help? Does that represent the safety that this man had and now he's been discovered and he won't be able to go back into that hiding place? We could also, there's a lot of questions and interpretations we could have for that window. And one of the things that's interesting, look at the sky and look at the clouds. And you'll notice there's either an ingathering storm that the clouds will soon completely cover the sky, or perhaps it's the opposite. Maybe the sky is getting clearer. Maybe the sun will be shining on that little blossom of hope. We don't know. But again, a very, very evocative painting of a man who would soon be murdered. And Felix Nussbaum wanted this to happen. He wanted us to sit in 2020 and see his work. And one of his last words, he says, how did he make his artwork, by the way? He had friends who were able to, non-Jewish friends who managed to smuggle him in paint and colors and canvas. What's really interesting is when you see the artwork itself in front of you, places like Yad Vashem, you'll see that where he didn't have enough paint, he's conserving paint. He's using what we call a wash, saving the paint for the areas that he really wants to emphasize. And there's a lot of washes. This is really the work of a man who didn't have that much paint to work with. But one of his last desires that his artwork would not die with him, that it would somehow outlive him, whatever his fate would be, and people would be able to see what he was going through. And when you see the body of his work, you see a man whose mind is beginning to unravel from being in hiding, from being terrified, seeing doesn't know what's going to happen to him. Towards the end of his life, he starts to use the image of skeletons quite often. Death is encroaching. Really kind of work that just kind of ripped your heart out. Felix Nussbaum. Okay, friends. We are now going to travel, in the Zoom, to Terezin chat. Many of you may have visited, which is a place that is very, very resonant to me. My family was murdered in Treblinka. My family is from Grodno, Poland, but I have a very bizarre connection to to Terezin. I'm not quite sure why. But here is what Terezin looks like today. It's a little garrison town. It was built in the 1780s, named after one of the renowned anti-Semites in history, Maria Theresa, who actually threw the Jews out of Prague in the 1740s. And this is her memorial, this little garrison town that was supposed to protect Prague from invading armies. It was already obsolete by the 1800s, and by the late 1930s, early 1940s, it was a town that was used by a population who kind of lived in the middle. But there were huge military barracks that had been abandoned since World War I, and they were falling apart. The place was filled with lice and fleas, these barracks. They were inhabitable. There was no toilets. The toilets had broken. It was really a terrible place. And this is the place where, starting in 1941, in the fall of 1941, late fall of 1941, Jews were forced to move to from Czech Republic first, and later on from places like Germany, Austria, etc. Why Terezin? The Czech Jews were very akin to German Jews. They spoke German, many of them. They spoke Czech. They were not religious. There was no real Hasidic movement in this part of Czech Republic, not Czechoslovakia. What the Nazis would call Bohemia and Moravia when they take it over in 1939. And at the beginning, they sent about 5 or 6 transports of Jews to ghettos in the east, just as they did with Jews from Germany. They sent them to Lodz ghetto, they sent them to Minsk, they sent them to ghettos in the east, but it wasn't quick enough. And it wasn't a way of effectively getting rid of these people. And the Jews were promised that they would not be sent to the east, it would be sent someplace closer to home. Very, very tragic. The whole story of Terezin is a tragic one and all by itself. I won't go into too many details about that now. That's the story for a whole nother lecture. But by 1941 and 42, end of 41, December 1941, by 1942, transports were arriving almost daily for the first 8 months from Prague. And after that also, as I said, from Germany, Austria, later on, even from places like Holland, etc. This is the Terezin the Nazis wanted us to remember. And I'll talk about why they wanted us to think about it this way. Most of these come from an infamous film. Those of you who are working in Holocaust museums are familiar with the story. By 1944, the Nazis had created the second film showing what a wonderful place Terezin was. Of course, it is complete and utter fabrication. It was made under duress with actors who were forced under duress. The only real moment of joy, if you look on the top, this is the Terezin Football League. That's the only real moment in these films. And on the picture on the bottom right, that was taken by Maurice Russell, who was a real, I don't want to use an expletive, but he was a member of the 3-man Red Cross team who came to investigate the ghetto. By 1943, when about 430 some Jews from in Denmark who hadn't been saved in that great rescue of the Danish Jews were sent to Theresienstadt, the Danish king wanted to check on the status of these Danish Jews, and he demanded a Red Cross visit. Well, it took the commandant to give us some time. In that time period, about 17,000 Jews were sent to what's called the Czech family camp in Auschwitz, in Birkenau, right at the beginning of Birkenau, and that's all part of this deception. So if the Red Cross actually came, they wouldn't have to go all the way into Birkenau. They would just come like in the entrance, and would be able to see this relatively nicer camp. Of course, when the Red Cross didn't come, those people were murdered. And Maurice Russell was this 25-year-old guy who came from Switzerland. Really, this was a nice, cushy job for him. And he comes to the ghetto and he's completely bought. He's completely, bamboozled by what the Nazis wanted him to believe. He didn't ask why the head of the Jewish council Pavel Epstein, why he had a black eye. He didn't ask to go beyond the pathway that they were shown on this visit. He accepted it all at face value. We said, what are the Jews complaining about? This is an end lager. This is a nice camp. And he takes more than 20 photographs kind of showing what a nice camp this was. Years later, he was asked by Claude Lanzmann, how could you have been so fooled? Why were you so easy to take this at face value? Why didn't you go and ask to go into the buildings? Why didn't you question why Pavel Epstein had a black eye? Why didn't you ask more? And his answer was, it was the fault of the Jews. They should have approached me. They should have talked to me. They should have told me what was going on. Nobody did that, so it's their fault. And if you have the patience, there's actually a film that Claude Lanzmann made interviewing this person. It's infuriating. Anyway, that's kind of the setup. That's kind of the backdrop. That's the Terezin they wanted you to see. Now, a group of artists were forced by the Nazis to create art. This is their art studio. This is a drawing by the artist Leo Haas. What does it mean to create art? Well, the Nazis had all of these brilliantly talented people. They had charts they wanted to decorate. They had pictures of the Mona Lisa they wanted to copy and give to girlfriends and wives. They had artwork. They had greeting cards they wanted to make. What a fabulous source of free artwork to really imprison these artists in an art studio and force them to create art. And here Leo Haas, look at the conditions, by the way. Any of you who are artists, to try and draw right on top of each other like that. Look at the crowded conditions. These are people who don't have adequate food, drawing artwork for the Nazis. And they make an incredible act of resistance. Some ghettos had the framework where you could have some kind of uprising. About 100 ghettos did. All of them, of course, doomed to failure. There was no way to have an uprising in Theresienstadt. They didn't have the means. They didn't have the people who could, help them smuggle in guns, etc. It couldn't happen in this ghetto. How are they going to fight back? They're going to fight back through their artwork. They're going to say, this is what they want you to believe. We're going to show you the reality. It's an incredibly brave move. And I want to show you how that works. Bedřich Frita, brilliant, brilliant artist. We'll talk about him more after. This is a drawing he makes for the Nazis, building the barracks. And remember, I told you that when Theresienstadt was entered in late 1941, they had a group of men who were called in English, the building committee. They were forced to get the ghetto ready for all the incoming people who were going to be shoved in there. And this is what the Nazis wanted you to think that building work looked like. Nice and orderly. Notice how the men are healthy and they're wearing workman's clothing, and notice the nice neat wood. Looks great. Bedřich Frita really wanted you to see what was happening. And this artwork he creates in 1943, based on the memories of these people coming in and building. Look at the chaos here. Look what they have to work with. How are you going to fit so many people in a place that's literally falling apart? Look at how they've built. A lot of these men who were on the building committee, they weren't construction workers. They didn't really know how to build, bunk beds, etc. They were going to kind of slap them together. And look at this picture behind them. People are coming in, people are building, people are lugging luggage, people are taking luggage from one place to another. All of this frenzied preparation to prepare for this, thousands of people who are going to be arriving every day and shoved into the ghetto. So we have that drawing that he was forced to make for the Nazis, and this is the one for us. This is the truth. This is what's really happening. Leo Haas is another one of these artists. Now, 4 of these artists were actually caught by the Nazis for creating horror propaganda, which I think is very, very ironic, that who was doing the real horror here. Horror propaganda to the Nazis meant showing the truth of Terezin. Let's go check the time real quick. Showing the truth of Terezin. This is what it's really like. And 4 of those artists were sent to Auschwitz. The only one who survived was Leo Haas. He was actually part of Operation Bernard in Sachsenhausen, which was this attempt to kind of flood the European market, or the world market, with fake money. He survives, and he leaves this amazing testimony behind. So Leo Haas kind of gave us almost, if you can call it, a cheat sheet of Terezin. Look at this amazing piece of work. And when you actually see it at Yad Vashem, it's incredible. It's rather large, and it is a ink pen and ink wash, like washes using ink. We get a lot of grades of different colors there. And let's look at it together, because he shows us everything that's happening in this camp. If you look on the right, you can see hidden in the attic, up here in the attic, musicians secretly practicing music. Below them, you could see elderly people living in horrific conditions. Look at the bunk beds, look at the ladders. We're going to talk about the plight of elderly people in this camp. It's something people don't usually talk about. We could see in the front, there is still a religious life here. Many of the Jews from Prague, for example, who weren't particularly religious before the war and before the Holocaust, many of them said we kind of came back to ourselves as Jews in the ghetto. If we were going to be, persecuted as Jews, what does it mean to be Jewish? Young people are kind of learning about being Jewish, putting on tefillin, kind of coming back to being Jewish, more actively Jewish. We see a nurse taking care of a little baby here in the front. It's incredible that even in such a horrible place, they try to take care of children. Children were put into children's homes, which we'll talk about in a minute. And we see people coming in. There's this constant stream of people coming in and people leaving, people being deported. And we see there were hearses, I think 2 or 3 hearses that were actually used, if you look on the lower left, in Terezin as conveyances to take people around the ghetto, to take their luggage to storage areas, to distribute bread, take corpses to the morgue which is in the walls of the ghetto itself. And on the left, you can see that at the beginning, they actually buried bodies kind of in without having their names written on the graves, but after that, it became too much, and by 1942, late 42, early 43, they opened up a crematoria for my friends who aren't Jewish. Cremation is not part of the Jewish religion. It's something that is very, very, it's a desecration. But these people had no choice. So the bodies were cremated, but to give them some dignity in death, their bodies were put into little boxes. And in 1944, I think it was like 20,000 of these boxes were dumped into the Oje, the river that runs near the camp. We could see the filth, we could see the desperation. We see this artist on the upper left kind of looking over the fence, looking at the sunrise or the sunset, maybe dreaming of freedom. We see something very unusual. If you look in the middle of the drawing on the top, you see a church. And that church was built also at the time that the garrison town was built. It was used during the time the Jews were there. But there it is, the church kind of in the light, unaffected by all of this, kind of overlooking this scene. And again, the motif of the dead tree in the middle. So that's kind of an overview of Theresienstadt in one drawing, one work by Leo Haas. Leo Haas also chronicled what was happening in the ghetto. And what's amazing, for those of you, I don't know, many of you, some of you may actually have family members who were in Terezin. Maybe some of you were actually, those of you who are survivors, maybe survivors of this terrible place. Every survivor I've ever talked to about this ghetto remembers specific events that are etched into their memories, that are indelible, that we have no photographs of. All we have is the artist's interpretations. And one thing they all remember is the hanging in 1943 of 9 young men who were accused of writing letters. They were hung in public. Everyone was forced to watch. Almost every single survivor who was there at the time remembers how horrible that was. And here, Leo Haas kind of captures it in the drawing. Notice how he draws Nazis. They look almost like wolves. Look at this figure second to the right with his kind of wolfish face. Notice right in the middle of the picture, we have the commander. Look how big his hand is. He's holding the noose. His legs are splayed. He's wearing his uniform. And we have the helpless people standing and watching. And you can see some of the faces. If you look in the front, these 2 elderly people in the front look very disgusted by what they're seeing. And it's a big contrast to these people who are kind of in shadow. And notice how the light is kind of on this young victim hanging there for everyone to see. Another event that nobody ever forgot was in 1943, January 10th. And if you've ever been to Czech Republic, freezing cold at that time. And the Nazis decided these are just ways of terrorizing the population. It was the SS that ran Terezin. It was, this is why we consider it a concentration camp / ghetto / what's the word, deportation camp? I forgot the word. Like Drancy, I forgot the word, a transit camp. And to terrorize the population and to kind of quell any ideas that there might be some kind of uprising. January 10th, 1943, they took the entire population of the ghetto, many of them elderly people, many of them children. They took them to a place called Bohuslavichi Hollow, which is about 1.5 kilometers away from the camp. And they forced them to stand outside literally all day in the freezing cold. Hours and hours and hours of standing there while they were counted. Many, many, many people died. It was just too much. Many of the elderly people, you can kind of see here, there are bodies on the floor. Look at all the baby carriages. Can you imagine dragging these little children and babies out to stand in freezing cold January weather to be counted? And one of the kids who wrote for the magazine Vedum, which we'll talk about soon, wrote about this. And he wrote, "We stood there numb with cold, starving and exhausted for a full 12 hours. We could hear the sick calling out, the small children crying, old people fainted, and we shifted from one foot to the other uncertainly. What will they do with us next?" Someone asked. Nothing. No one knew anything. We thought that this time they would leave us here to die of hunger and cold. There were 30,000 of us and only a few of them. Yet there was nothing we could do in our impotence. We had no weapons and they would have gunned us down. We were all very weak as well. We have a few artists who draw the same scene, the Sperre, the counting in the Bohuslavichi Hollow. Another one of the drawings that he makes, which I think is particularly powerful, and notice the use of the darkness and the light, the shadow and the light here, is called SS Dog, which is an interesting title because the dog, which is here on the front, you can interpret him in different ways. For me, being a dog owner, he doesn't seem to be particularly menacing. He's looking down at the ground. His tongue is out. He's kind of schlepping along. And here we have, but you can interpret it also in your way. It has a little collar on that says SS. Perhaps he's another victim of the Nazis. He's being forced into this role where dogs are supposed to be loyal to humanity, and here he is. So many Holocaust survivors had a fear of dogs for the rest of their lives. They said that when the Nazis sicked these terrible dogs on us, they never forgot that. But look at the people who are being deported here. Elderly people, a nurse, a pregnant woman, a man holding the bundles of the family, dragging out in Terezin. They didn't actually build the railway into the camp until 1943. Before that, people had to go to a town called Bohuslavichi nad Odrze, which is about 2 kilometers away. And they literally had to carry their bundles and walk in the freezing cold or the boiling heat into the camp. So here they are on their way out. Do you notice there's only one face that's looking at us in this drawing? Everyone else is kind of lost in their own thoughts, lost in their misery, just trying to walk. But we have this little child who's kind of engaging us, looking at us. And I always wonder, what is that child saying to us? Why is this happening? Why are you allowing this to happen? Where am I going to go? What are you going to take away from what's happening to us? It's always really that child looking at you. And if you're familiar with the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial monument, which we have both in Yad Vashem and in Warsaw in front of the Polin Museum, on the back part of the memorial is this very melancholy parade of people being led off. There it's to Treblinka. And look at this, the same thing in that piece of work. There's only one child who looks at us and kind of grabs us with his eyes, involving us and making us part of the scene. All right, you're looking at some lovely faces of elderly people here. And I think their story is often one of the forgotten stories about Terezin, because there's this tendency to talk about the arts and the music and the opera and everything else that happens in the camp. And there's this tendency to kind of see this as this almost, wonderful, magical place in the midst of horror. People are still, that's very untrue. And it's a very unfair way of talking about Terezin. It's unfair to the people who were there. Because the majority of the people had no opportunity to take part in any cultural events. The majority of them were murdered. 88,000 people were sent away to be murdered. Some people were only in the camp for a mere week, 2 weeks, and about 42,000 of them never actually went to Auschwitz. And we'll talk about one of the most difficult parts of this whole story, which was the fate of elderly people. In Germany, the Nazis had a little bit of a problem. By 1941, when they start to send Jews away, when they start to deport Jews, there was actually some decent human beings who asked questions. Where are you sending the upstairs neighbor away to? And the answer they would usually get is, they're being sent to the east, they're going to be doing something useful, they're going to be working, they're going to have a better life there. And some of these braver people would say, what, you're sending the upstairs neighbor away to the east to work? The upstairs neighbor is 95 years old. She sits in a wheelchair. She's blind. What kind of work is she going to do in the east? Or, you're sending the downstairs neighbor away to work. He's a World War I veteran. He lost both of his legs fighting for Germany in World War I. What kind of work is that man going to do in the east? The Nazis get a little nervous. This is all part of this deception they're going to build to present this place as what they would call a spa town. And at the Wannsee conference in January 1942, the idea is put forward that the elderly people of Germany would be kind of sent to the spa town of Terezin. And I'm going to show you how this is going to work. Look at this piece of paper. It is a legal document that elderly people were forced to sign. It's called a house purchasing document. See, this was signed by a man called Hirschfeld. It is promising them, in exchange for their apartment, they're going to be getting a nice apartment in the spa town. It actually tells them they're going to be getting 3 hot meals a day. They're going to be getting medical coverage. They're going to be getting social benefits in the spa town. And you can see all the signatures. They all have to sign it. Some of these poor people have, what's it called? Can no longer think clearly. Once they sign this, they're forced to leave their apartments. So those of you who have been to Berlin, they're taken to the Miete section of Berlin. They're taken to a house on Große Hamburger Straße. This building actually didn't have any facilities for people to sleep in. Some of them were there for almost a week. And then they were forced to walk almost 7 kilometers through the city of Berlin. Can you imagine this scene of elderly people holding their little bundles after having been in this building for a week with not a lot of, couldn't wash themselves, barely had anything to eat. They were sleeping on the floor. And in Berlin, they're taken to 3 train stations. And from there, they're put into regular train carriages, second-class train cars, which are usually attached to a regular train car. So you can imagine people are getting on the train with all of their luggage and their families. And in the last car, they're kind of shoving in these poor old people. And they're taken to Theresienstadt. Again, most of them had to walk, that walk from Husavich nad Oje. They're taken into the camp. They're robbed of everything almost immediately when they arrive. And then they're put into, not into these promised apartments, but they're put into barracks, usually in the attic. You can imagine the poor 95-year-old grandma trying to climb up a ladder to get into a tiny bunk bed. It's absolutely appalling. Over 100 of these people died a day. In 1942, the Nazis, this is a Nazi estimate, said that 60% of the people in Theresienstadt were over the age of 60. And it reaches its overcrowding in 1942. There were about 145,000 people. Not 145,000, that's how many came through. There's about 50 or 60,000 people kind of smashed together in this terrible place. And the Nazis say there's too many elderly people here. So they create what they call the Alta Transporta. There are about 10 transports of elderly people to the death camp of Treblinka. Treblinka in northeast Poland, not too far away from Warsaw. Of those people who were sent to Treblinka, and I've actually did a lot of research into the list, I don't think I put the pie chart in this PowerPoint, but usually in one of the pie charts, 80% of the people on one of these transports were elderly Jewish women above the age of 60. Of all those people who were sent to Treblinka, about 10,000 people, the last transports they put a few younger people on, only about 3 of them survived. And one of them was Richard Glazer, who takes part in the uprising in Terezin in Treblinka in 1943. So that's the background. Now let's look at the artwork. Moritz Müller was a Czech Jew from Prague. Before the war, he was kind of renowned in the art scene. He had an art gallery, and sent to the camp, and he goes to work in the hospital for elderly people with urinary tract infections, urinary diseases. You can imagine without antibiotics to clear up a urinary tract infection, these people are suffering terribly. It's a terrible death. They're going to die there, like anonymously in a hospital, far away from home, far away from everyone they love. Their bodies are going to be dumped into either a grave or cremated. And he feels an incredible pity for these poor people. He doesn't want them to go to their death anonymously. He wants to show that they once lived. And he does something really incredible. He makes hundreds of portraits of these people lying in their hospital beds. You can see 2 examples here. Very human, very beautiful portraits. He sometimes asks the people if they're able to remember their names, writes those down, writes down the dates. He draws the medical staff also, these incredible staff who without anything, without any medicine, no way of treating these people, are taking care of these elderly people. And what he leaves behind is this real gallery, this real testimony that these people once lived. And I've done a lot of research. I wanted to see if I could actually find the faces, the pictures of the people he's listed here. And I was never able to find anything, no pictures, no anything from these people. He himself was murdered in 1944. He did not survive, but his artwork survived. Many people ask me, how did artwork survive in Terezin? Unlike Warsaw, it wasn't destroyed. The ghetto is, the buildings are still intact, even in 2020, and they're still actually finding things in the walls even today. What time it is? Elisa Sheck, who is a survivor from Terezin, writes about these old people. And she says, she was a young girl at the time. She said, these old people were really a nightmare to all of us. They were the ones who were starving the most, had the worst dwellings, were sick continuously, and were naturally dying. Every day, scores of them died. We saw them sitting around on benches, dressed in their city clothes with hats and knitted gloves, somehow pretending to live a normal life. It was also pathetic and horrible to see them sitting there, engaged in conversation, formally addressing each other as Herr Professor and Frau Doctor. They were all lonely here. Their families had either emigrated or been deported. When I have nightmares, it's just about these old people. They were completely lost. And I think that's part of Terezinstadt that we don't usually talk about. And I think we owe it to those people who, reached the years in their lives where they should have been comfortable, where they should have been kind of enjoying the fruits of all of their years, and had their lives so brutally taken away from them. And this painting, this drawing, this ink drawing by Bredrik Frita, I think is incredibly powerful. It's called Before the Transport. We see one of these women with nothing left. Everything she owns is just this bundle of, these bundles she's sitting on. The technique, if you excuse my pronunciation, it's called chiaroscuro. For my artist friends, sorry for the pronunciation, but it's very strong use of light and shadow. Notice that her face is in shadow. The one thing that the light is actually kind of highlighting is the Jewish star in her chest and her hands kind of folded together hopelessly. There's no background. She's kind of there floating. The fate of these elderly people being sent off. And I'm going to focus now on Bredrik Frita, because here he is. This is a drawing done by him, by Leo Haas. And I want you to see the artwork he created for us. This is what he wanted us to see. You living in 2020, this is what Terezin was really like. You heard about the operas, you heard about the concerts. These are people being sent away to Poland. And notice again, that technique of the very dark shadow, the bright lights on their faces. Notice this man filling out their names, incredibly depressing. There's no individuality here. They're being sent off to be murdered. This is a drawing he wanted us to see. This is who I am. I'm an art slave. They may not actually be working in a mine, but I'm a slave nonetheless. I have to create this artwork for the Nazis. And here he is. But he doesn't arrive by himself. Bedřich Frita arrived with his wife and a little boy called Tomi. And Tomi Frita, I have a dear friend who actually knew Tomi after the war, we're not quite sure. She says he was about 7 months old when he arrived in the ghetto. Tomi, this is a drawing that his father wanted Tomi to see. This is for us, a drawing of the art slave. This is the drawing for little Tomi. Tomi, as a baby in the ghetto, did not have any of the delights that young children have. He never walked on grass. He didn't know what a full stomach felt like. He never held a kitten on his lap. He never knew what a big delicious piece of chocolate cake must have tasted like. All he knew was the ghetto. And for his 3rd birthday, by the way, here is the Bedřich Frita for us, and here is the private Bedřich Frita for his little boy Tomi. For Tomi's 3rd birthday, his father makes him an amazing gift. What can he give him in the ghetto? And the gift he wants to give him is the gift of hope and the gift of a future. So for his 3rd birthday, he creates this book called For Tomi on his 3rd birthday. Look at the little tush there. Look at that drawing. I love that drawing. For those of you who have been to Auschwitz and have seen the display of suitcases in Auschwitz I, many of those suitcases were from the last transports of Jews who came from Terezin in October 1944. This will look very familiar to you who have been there, this old-fashioned suitcase. He's standing looking at the bird and the tree, maybe kind of unintentional, but motifs we've seen before from Felix Nussbaum. And he begins by showing all the cute things Tomi's doing. For us, those of us with kids or grandkids, take lots of pictures. He didn't have that opportunity, so he's drawing the very cute things Tomi's doing. Tomi's big, Tomi's little, Tomi's being naughty, Tomi's saying no, no, no. And then he says, Tomi, that train that comes into the ghetto, we'll probably go on a train like that too. But ours is going to take us somewhere beautiful. And these things are in the world and you'll be seeing them. And look at that kind of garden of paradise there with the flowers and the butterflies. And he says, what is my Tomi going to do when he gets there in the future? My Tomi could be an engineer. My Tomi can be a detective. My Tomi could be an artist. Just don't be a general or a banker, he tells them. Remember, the man's bohemian. And he also makes this beautiful drawing. Mommy and Daddy can't wait to meet the girl you'll bring home to us one day. And I love that drawing. And of course, his poor parents, his father was murdered in Auschwitz. His mother dies in Terezin. Never got a chance to meet his bride. From my friend Jana, who did know Tomi in Prague after the war. Very sadly, his wife after the war, I think about 20 years ago, also committed suicide. She was also the daughter of survivors, and she couldn't live with the ghosts of her parents' past, and she committed suicide. But here is this beautiful, hopeful moment. Tomi the gentleman with his future wife. And the last page, I think, is also the saddest. It says, this is one of many books Daddy will be making for you in your lifetime. And shortly after that, his father was arrested for creating the horror propaganda. The family was thrown into the little fortress. His father was sent to Auschwitz, where he was murdered. Tomi manages to survive, and Leo Hess raises him. Leo Hess raises him in Prague after the war. And Tomi says this, Tomi Frita, he died, by the way, about 4 or 5 years ago. And see that book, and we have a copy of the book in Yad Vashem. We don't have the original book because he would not let it ever leave his possession. And he said, the only thing that remains to me, that belongs to me, that was made for me alone, is my book, a book from my father. In that book, I could feel him, his tears, his hope, his fear. Okay, I'm just going to ask, how much time do we have? How much time do we have left?
It's about 5 to 12 here. So if you want to carry on for what, 5 more minutes or something?
5 more minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just gonna, as I said, I can talk for ages. I'm just gonna end with, this will be for another time, with something a little bit kind of more hopeful. And I'm gonna talk about the artist Yehuda Bakon. Yehuda Bakon was from Czechoslovakia, from Bohemian Moravia. He's sent to Terezin. He draws in Terezin with some of these amazing teachers who are, people are teaching children art. The most famous is Friedel Dicker Brandeis, who's one of my idols. He's sent after to Auschwitz, survives Auschwitz, liberated in a state of really grave illness. And it takes him a while till he's only 16 years old at the time, when he gets his ability back to actually draw. This is very shortly after he's liberated. He makes one of the most powerful pieces of artwork from the Holocaust. It's called The Memory of the Czech Transports, but it's really kind of a portrait of his father. And if you look at this drawing, first of all, look how frenzied he is, those lines. This isn't something he's making calmly. His memory is very frenzied, and he's busy drawing these frenzied features. We see his father kind of gazing off into past us, again, not engaging us with his eyes. Such an unusual, terrible depiction of his father coming out of the chimney of the gas chamber. And on the bottom left here, we see this little figure. Now we know that right before, they had been in the family camp, and the Nazis separated about 85 young boys. We're not quite sure why. Separated them from the other camp, put them in what was then the punishment camp, and later on moved them to another man's camp. And these little boys were allowed to live, and they were part of a commando called the Rolling Commando. They had to like push a big wagon all over Auschwitz, collect wood, collect corpses. And the members of the Sonderkommando, the men who were forced to burn the bodies, would let these young boys in the freezing cold actually come into the crematoria when it wasn't being used to kind of warm up from the freezing cold conditions. And Yehuda Bakon remembers one of these Sonderkommando telling him, "You can't come in today, it's being used." Survives, remembers that right before he was separated with these young boys, his father stood on the second side of the fence because they were in the camp right next door, this camp next door to camp, separated by barbed wire. And in his later memory, he said his father offered him a piece of bread. But in his earlier recollections that he gave in the 80s of this encounter, he said, "My father offered me his gold teeth so that I would have something. So whatever my fate would be, I should have a piece of gold. I would be able to use it to bribe someone to help myself." I think that remained an indelible part of his memory. He talks about it a lot when he gives testimony, even though time and memory has changed that testimony a little bit. But look at the little figure kind of hanging on the fence, clinging to the barbed wire, seeing this image of his father kind of disappearing up in smoke. It's a very powerful drawing. This is an angry, frustrated kid. He doesn't want to live anymore. He has no faith in humanity. 16 years old, he feels his life is over. How can he ever trust anyone again? And that's really where the power of goodness plays such a beautiful part. Because this man called Przemysl Pitter works with a group of very good Czech people in the end of World War II. They create a series of homes for children who have survived, not only Jewish children, also German children. And remember, in Prague in May, there's a little uprising for 3 days. And the Czechs fight back against the Nazis, and any Germans seen on the streets are murdered, and their families. There's a lot of retribution, and there's a lot of children wandering the streets who are German. There's Czech kids wandering the streets. He gathers them all in. And when people say, "Why are you taking care of these German kids? They're the enemy," he says, "if we ever want to have a future where there won't be a war anymore, where people understand each other, all of these people are worthy. All of these children are just children. They all need to be raised together, and they need to be given the chance." He takes the child survivors out of Theresienstadt, and one of those survivors is his angry, bitter Yehuda Bakon. And through the sheer force of his love, this is an amazing man. He says, you can't be Christian in church. You have to be Christian how you act, how you treat people, how you live your life. That's a true Christian life. He kind of brings this little boy back to life through the power of his love. And the drawing, which is also made in 1945, has a really beautiful title. It's called To the Man Who Restored My Belief in Humanity. And Shemysl Pitter became what we call a righteous among the nations in the 1960s, to be someone who could restore our faith in humanity, which is what righteous people are, is an incredible thing. And if you look at this drawing, drawn again by a 16-year-old little boy, here, if you look on the upper right, we can see the gas chamber of Birkenau. We see kind of the dead self lying here, blood coming out of the head. And we could see him kind of leading him to the light towards this tree, which also symbolizes life, but it's a palm tree. And those of you who have ever been to Czech Republic, there's no palm trees in Czech Republic. The only one I know in that region of the world is a big, beautiful plastic tree in Warsaw. But shortly after this, he comes on Youth Aliyah, and he comes to Israel, where he has lived ever since. When I studied in Betzalel, he was actually one of the teachers in Betzalel. And I just think that's kind of a hopeful way to end this talk. We see the lowest humanity can sink, that people do nothing. But we also see that some people were able to help, were able to rise above. And we also see that incredible power of art. And if the Nazis said the Jews do not create anything, they don't bring anything new into the world, they don't bring beauty into the world, I think every single one of these artworks, every single one of these drawings is a testimony to the human spirit, to their creative humanity. And that's something that can never be taken away. And that really was a triumph over the Nazis. So I could have talked for another 20 hours, but we're going to stop it there because I know that some of you have questions.
Liz, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, really for sharing all those examples and all your knowledge, really engaging with these images with us. Thank you so much. We've had a lot of people, if you have a glance at the chat, just thanking you for the wonderful presentation and really asking for more. So we might...
you want to do a part 2?
If you are gracious enough to give us your time.
No one's going anywhere during this pandemic. I'll be happy to do it.
Wonderful. So I'm going to invite anybody who wants to ask any questions. You can use the raise hand option if you want to ask directly to Liz, or you're more than welcome to just write your question into the chat.
I don't really know how to do any of these thingies. So if you don't mind, Catherine, reading out the questions.
I will do that. I'll do that for you, no problem.
Liz, if you don't mind, just to stop your presentation, that we can see you fully.
Okay, so how do I do stop share? Okay.
Stop share, yeah. There we go. Brilliant. Now we can see everybody again. So you can put on your cameras and we can see everybody. While we wait for some questions, I wanted to ask a question particularly. We have in our exhibition in Johannesburg quite a few examples of artwork made by children in Theresienstadt. And I just wondered whether you looked at artwork made by children differently, or presented artwork made by children differently to the way you think about and talk about artwork made by adults, and whether there is a difference and how you approach those two.
That's a great question. Thanks, Catherine. I think that when we talk about children's art from Terezin, we really have to talk also about the children, but also who gave them that kind of conduit to expressing themselves, and that's Friedel Dicker-Brandeis, who was an amazing artist from Vienna. Comes to live in Prague. Am I here?
Yeah.
Yes. And she, in a nutshell, she teaches art to more than 600 children in the ghetto, and teaches in such a way that artwork becomes a type of art therapy. You know, how do you deal with not seeing your parents? How do you deal with starvation? How do you deal with transports leaving all the time? How do you deal with missing home? How do you deal with, a family member being taken away? How did children cope with such terrible things? And it was through artwork that she helped them cope, which I think is what makes why you kind of have to talk about her in connection to children's art. Because for those of you who have been to Terezin, for example, to Prague, for example, I've been to the Pinkas synagogue and gone upstairs and seen the beautiful artwork, or saw the book I Never Saw Another Butterfly. A lot of the time she used the artwork as a way of freeing children from the confines of Terezin for a few brief hours through artwork. She has the children draw pets. She has the children draw vases filled with flowers. She has them remember what Pesach was like, what Passover was like in their families. She has them draw, there's a beautiful drawing of fish in a tank. All of that is a way of kind of taking them out of the horrors of the ghetto for a brief few moments. So if you know that, I think the way you look at children's art, you suddenly understand it in a different way. You know, children are the most creative, unfettered artists. They just create. And the fact that there were people who were willing, when Friedel actually comes to Theresienstadt, she only brings, in the 50 kilos she's allowed to bring, she only brings a few, items for herself, but she fills her suitcases up with art supplies and paper and scissors and big sheets so that she can make backdrops for Wunderbar, the children's opera that's performed in the ghetto. So I see those artworks almost as a form, and this is, today she's considered like a, what's it called? One of the pioneers of art therapy, also was a therapeutic method for children to cope with what they're dealing with in the ghetto.
Thank you for answering that. I see Carolyn's got a question, so if you would like to unmute yourself, Carolyn, and you can put your question to Liz.
Oh, so thank you. I thought that was fascinating, amazing imagery. I just want to say, in terms of Felix Nussbaum, if he was an artist, I mean, I really liked what you said, but that thing of the broken tree with almost like a cherry blossom and those crows, it almost reminded me of Van Gogh very, very much in terms of the birds, the crows, and the cherry blossoms. Van Gogh did something. And if Nussbaum was an artist, Van Gogh had passed away 50 years before, so he might have known that kind of art, and that's the kind of thing he might have been referring to.
Oh, definitely. I think, all artists are kind of influenced, and he studied in the art academy, he studied art history, he knew art history. And I'm sure these are all references, artists kind of sometimes reference other artists and reference other genres. And I think that's a wonderful point. I'm sure that was also maybe a reference, and maybe he was kind of taking it to a different place.
And I think so. And I just want to say, especially because of those crows, because some people here will know the artwork. In Van Gogh's The Crows, it is about death and destruction and despair. So I think it's not just visual. I think he's drawing on the metaphor of that as well.
Oh, definitely. And if you're really interested, for anyone who wants to know more about Felix Nussbaum, last time I checked, the Osnabrück Museum, if you look up Felix Nussbaum, look up the museum Osnabrück. There's a beautiful building that was created by Daniel, the architect who made the Berlin Museum in the Jewish Museum in Berlin. Having a moment, can't remember his name. Anyway, last time I checked, I may have changed it, they actually put every single one of his artworks online, more than 150 or 60 drawings and paintings. And when you go through the artwork and kind of, see the progression and see what this isolation and loneliness and fear is leading him to, it's an amazing window into the human mind. How do people deal with such fear and horror? And I think that's one of the things that makes his work really so fascinating also, is that we get this glimpse into his own psyche.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you, Daniel, for Daniel Liebskin. John and Helen, hi. Thank you. Daniel Liebskin, thank you. And thank you, Carolyn, for your question.
Michelle, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, please. Thank you very much. Can you tell us how these paintings were saved, or how we now have access to them? I've been to the children's collection of paintings in Terezin, but how were the rest of them saved?
That's also a very good question. Notice that even though we do have some artwork, for example, from Warsaw, work mainly that was like hidden as part of the Ringelblum archives, the Onyx Shabbat, and that was actually hidden in those milk cans and hidden in the boxes. We don't have a lot of artwork from ghettos that were completely destroyed. We do have a lot from Terezin because, again, Terezin was not destroyed. Big attics, places where you could hide things. There was actually an art, I believe he was an art collector who managed to get some of the artwork out of Theresienstadt. That is what caused the Nazis to take those 4 artists in as horror propagandists. From what I know about Felix Nussbaum, his work was found all bundled up in like a huge bundle and folded. I think some of his colleagues had actually kind of taken the work away after he died and hid it. So some of it is hidden, some of it was entrusted to other people, some of it come from, it's amazing, but in some cases there were actually Nazis who collected Jewish art, a few cases here and there. But again, it's really only the tip of the iceberg, what we have, and every single case is different, how we found it. And remember that most of it was not saved, and most of it we'll never get a chance to see. And there were many pre-war artists, brilliant, brilliant artists whose work was destroyed by the Nazis, and we will never get to see that work again. Thank you.
There is a question from Gabriela. She's wondering about the material used, how the lack or the process of the acquisition of material contributed to the narrative of this very particular art.
Well, that's a great question, because how do you make art where you have no access to art supplies? So in the cases of, you know, the artists of Terezin, they had access to art supplies either because they worked for the artist's workshop and would steal literally paper, pencils, watercolors, and create the artwork at night. Friedel Dicker Brandeis had friends who weren't Jewish who were able to send her Red Cross packages. That's why sometimes we'll see papers that the children drew on that has, you know, typing and has, you know, you can see they were kind of forms. A wonderful, beautiful little boy who I will talk about maybe next time, called Peter Gintz, because his mother was not Jewish. She was able to send packages into the ghetto for Peter. And one of the things that children remember is that he shared everything he got. He always shared his things. It was amazing. In some cases, like Felix Nussbaum, friends supplied him with, you know, associates with his art supplies. That's why when you see it up close, for those of you artists, we have the liberty, well, maybe not now during the pandemic, but just usually to go out and buy paint and buy, you know, turpentine. He didn't have that liberty, so he really had to be very sparing with how he used the colors he had. That's why where it's not important, there's washes. And it's very, you know, touching to see an artist who's so detail-oriented, making these washes just to cover the canvas up. So yes, I think that how they acquired. By the way, I hope I didn't say it, but Yuda Bacon, the drawing he made of his father coming out the chimney, was looks like a piece of like the type of paper you would use to make sack with, like a very coarse brown paper, not art paper, not fancy art paper.
Okay, just an opportunity for any further questions.
So maybe I can ask you, Liz. I know
Anna.
we didn't. And sorry, did I push in?
Oh, hello, my dear.
Anna Maria.
Yes.
And this is my
Okay.
friend Anna Maria, who unfortunately I didn't get a chance to see on March of the Living this year. We all marched to our apartments in April.
Yes. So thanks to Tali's Holocaust and Genocide Center, I get a chance to see my friends that I would have seen in April. So thank you, Tali, again, and to your whole center and your staff for doing these webinars so that I can connect at least virtually with my friends. And Liz, I'm late because on Tuesday mornings I teach my Holocaust class.
Oh. You're going from Zoom to Zoom.
I hope, Catherine and Tali, if it's okay, I would like the recording of this, apart from the fact that I missed the beginning, but also that for my students, a lot of this, especially two of them, are very interested in artwork. And I also want to send it to a Czech friend of mine who paid so much attention to Terezin, that this is something that is very, it's such a great micro history, the Terezin camp, right, and why.
Yes.
So if I can share my screen, let me see if I can. Yeah, here tell me if you see this, if you guys see the Felix Nussbaum collection. So I haven't checked to see if everything is on.
Oh, wonderful. This is what I was talking about. Yes.
Exactly. So, and I was actually once at a conference on anti-Semitism that was at the Osnabrück Museum. And one of my friends said, we've got to go to the Liebeskind Museum. It did feel a little bit like a mini version of the Berlin Museum. But it is so tragic to go through this little museum, through these works, how many tragedies this man went through, survived, and then didn't survive the ultimate. So, but
and
yes.
Felka.
Yeah.
And what's so sad is Felka is very, excuse me?
Anna Maria, can you post in the chat the link, please, to this website?
Yeah.
That everyone
So in
can
a second, I'll copy the links. I also wanted to call attention to, in 2017, I think it was, there was this exhibit here in Krakow. The Auschwitz Museum put an exhibit in, if you who have been in Krakow, the Szołajski Palace, which is on Plac Szczepański, just off the main market square. And this artwork was really amazing. And it was exactly as Liz said earlier, that some of the artwork was done as slave labor for the German staff at Auschwitz.
Yeah. Auschwitz, they opened up an art gallery in 1941, which is pretty incredible.
Yeah, it's really funny, this exhibit, because also as there was the question about the materials, and they would like steal a stub of a pencil that, which was illegal, but a stub of a pencil that the accountant couldn't use anymore. So stubs of a pencil and any, also, as Liz pointed out, any scrap piece of paper, a paper sack, yeah, anything. And one of my colleagues from the museum during the opening, very interestingly, this work was all in very dark spaces, very dimly lit, so as not to destroy the work, because it was made in the most primitive of conditions. Light can destroy this. The one room of the exhibit where there was full-on light was the kitschy art that the Germans ordered. It was here is a picture of my country chalet in the Alps. Please paint it for my new home here in Oświęcim, in Auschwitz. Here is a stag on the cliff. I want it for my living room, etc. So it was really kitschy, horrible stuff. But one of my colleagues, Tali and Liz, probably Andrzej Kaczorzyk, so from the museum, he is the vice director of the museum, and he said that these portraits that they did of each other were, partly an artist, and Liz, you know this better than I do. An artist has to do art, has to. You can't stop. It's your voice, it's your identity. So part of it, they were doing it because to stay who they were, but also they were documenting, he said that this documented their starvation. It was a documentation also of the the imprisonment. Some of these were Jews, some of them were non-Jews, but of the conditions at Auschwitz. So just like the doctors in Warsaw, in the Ringelblum archive, documenting their own starvation, right? These portraits that they did at different time periods show the faces, right? Show the bodies getting thinner, so that it serves many purposes, not just one. And then the last thing, because so many people I know don't know where Terezin is, so I pulled it up so that people could see. This is the Waba. In Czech it's Waba, in German it's the Elbe River. And
it's Oje, the Oje River.
In Czech it's the Waba.
Waba and Oje. Busovice nad Oje. Yeah.
Okay, but okay. When I was there, my Czech friends called it the Waba. But in any case, but it's probably each branch, because you see this city, Ústí nad Labem, on the same. But you can see that it's in this very bucolic area, and it's also very flat, which makes it so that if anybody tried to escape, they would be very easily seen, very easily found. So, and this is so different from, when the first time that I was there, I was so shocked, because after seeing Auschwitz and all of these other places, you don't, or going to the city of Łódź and walking in the ghetto part of Łódź, or going to Warsaw and going to the ghetto part of Warsaw, or here in Kraków going to Podgórze. This was the whole town, right? And so, so then it would be very easy to fool the Red Cross and other visitors, approved visitors, that this was, very nice place. So,
Thank you, Anna Maria, for sharing.
I will put those links into the chat.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. I'm like Liz. I need my glasses to even find the chat button.
Great. Thank you, Anna Maria.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing those links. We have just one last question from Geordie. And the question is there a differentiation in imagery or any thematic differences seen in the artwork of children or descendants of Holocaust survivors who never experienced the Holocaust firsthand, but have been heavily affected by the trauma?
That's a great question also. And we actually had at Yad Vashem about 10 years ago now, a show of survivors, which is, first I'll talk about survivor artwork, which is also pretty incredible, because the same way survivor testimony changes over the years. And if you look at survivor testimony from 1945 or 1946, it's usually very, very direct. There's no sentimentality. They talk exactly about what happened, and it usually ends with something like, and since that time I have been living in the DP camp, I've been living in whatever place, and I'm not sure what my future will be. And when you see that same person giving testimony maybe 60 years later, it's softened. There's a lot more sentimentality. There's missing the parents. They've allowed themselves to talk about the parents or the family more. The childhoods become more idyllic, and it's always very important for them to add, and I had children and grandchildren, and this is what my grandchildren. It's the same thing in art, because the first art that was created right after the war, in Auschwitz, most of the artists who actually had the ability to create art were not Jewish artists, with very, very few exceptions. And one of them is, what's her name? The female woman artist from Warsaw, Halina Almutsky, who creates secret art, and then I talk about her next time. Most Jewish artists had no ability to create artwork, but the minute that they were able to after the war, their first impulse was to draw what was happening, draw the uniforms, draw people being beaten, draw all of it. A lot of that artwork was actually used in trials. Even Yuda Bakon's artwork was used in the Eichmann trial, what's fascinating is you see artwork that was created by artists in 1945, 46, 47, and the artwork that's created by the same artists in the 70s or 80s, everything is softened. There's an example I usually show of two artists, one of them showing the Majdanek when it was liberated, which is the artist Tolkachev, and another survivor from Majdanek who created artwork in the 70s, and everything is almost like a dream. It's like he can't quite recall the little details, but it's still there. So we see that a lot with Holocaust survivor art, and with second generation and third generation also, a lot of them are trying to make sense not so much about what happened to their their parents' experiences, something they couldn't experience, but how do I protect my parents? What did my parents go through? How has this influenced me? We had some interesting examples where this one artist had this big like piece of metal that was just holes dug into it. So just a whole thing with this holes dug into it in a circle. The metal itself, the piercing of the metal was all part of his statement. A lot of it is about, growing up with parents who weren't able to talk, parents who couldn't express themselves, parents who they felt they couldn't protect, which is also really fascinating. So you do see a change in how artwork changes over the years. It's fascinating. It's the same thing with survivor testimony. And if anyone wants to learn more, I think we still have it online at Yad Vashem. It was an art show we had about 10 years ago now about survivor artwork. And very sadly, we have thousands and thousands of artworks by survivors, but we can't show all of it because we don't have the facilities. So this was kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity. Each artist was allowed to show only one piece of work, which is very kind of sad. But you could see some of those works. I believe they are still online. It's fascinating.
Okay, thank you so much again.
So,
thank you for that answer.
Sadly, the time, and sadly, it's time to say goodbye. There is a request for part 2, and I think part 3 as well.
I will be more than happy. I will just tell me when, and I'm ready to go because nothing's happening with this corona.
Absolutely. There's so much to learn and so many different aspects, post-Holocaust, survivors, second generation, third generation, art in the concentration camps, art in, children art. So maybe a series that we can, we can do in the next months.
You tell me when. I can't have you make me the coffee, but I brought my own coffee, and you just tell me when, and I'm happy to be more than happy. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming.
Amazing. So thank you so much, Liz. If you can all show your appreciation and to Liz and her knowledge, and it was really, we learned so much. You empowered us.
Thank you.
Our colleagues from the Durban Holocaust and Genocide Center, Claudia Blith, said it, and I think the best out of everyone. Thank you so much for an incredible presentation. To me, art can feel like something that's only experts can know about, but today you've made it so accessible, much appreciated, and I think that's what we all feel, that you gave us tools that we can use now in our exhibitions. I thank all of you for joining. I thank Kath for hosting, Jordan, Delka, Dowie from our team for organizing. Please join us. We have a webinar on Thursday night at 7 o'clock. You will get the invitation today. It just was confirmed, but it is really a treat. It is a new book by Tal Brutman from France about analyzing the Auschwitz album. And it just got published. And it is things that you never seen, you never understood. And this will come your way today. So analyzing the Auschwitz album on Thursday evening, 7 p.m. our time. See this space for more details. Goodbye. Have a lovely, lovely day.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.